do not need to engage into into direct discussion or whatever, do not have a particular need to zoom in, will probably just watch the stream. Or afterwards, as it happened yesterday with Paul, we saw that, you know, the views soared during the night. We have around almost 300 views of last night's lecture. So I guess that's how it's going to be as long as we stream the seminars. Are we recording, Rista? Are we recording and are we streaming already?
We are streaming and we are recording. Sorry for that, because I have too much.
This was internal conversation, but never mind.
Oh, okay, okay. Sorry.
Let me start non-internally, officially, with the seminar. So, since this is the second session, I think it is in order to once again present the initiative, and then the speaker, Greg. So the School of Materialist Research is an informal platform of mainly digital learning, exchange of ideas, possibly at some point certain research initiatives, sort of virtual labs will emerge as a form of yet another form of activity of the school. It is mainly envisaged as something taking place online, but meetings offline and on coastlines is also something we dream of, and hopefully will come through one day. As I said, this is an informal study project, a project of exchange of ideas, initiated by several individuals with their institutions backing the project. At this moment, what we offer is, and hopefully in the future, this is our idea generally, will be something, you know, of the commons, completely free of charge, open to everybody, as long as we can survive in that mode. Once we reach a point when we have to be more imaginative about the ways of surviving or sustaining this initiative, we will let you know, everyone watching this right now or participating through Zoom at the moment. Yeah, just to mention the founding figures. So it's myself, me, Katarina Kolozova, Adam Nojek of Arizona State University, Iris van der Tuin, who is faculty of Utrecht University, but she's also affiliated to other schools in the Netherlands, including Eindhoven, which is actually the institution that is backing the initiative in this informal version of it currently, as it is currently. And finally, Vera Bühlmann and the Institute of Theory of Architecture in Vienna. So this is the setup of the initiative, and some sort of a vague sketch contours of how we imagine to function in the future, and at the moment we function in a way that is already presented on the web side, the web page that we set up recently. So this is open to anybody, everybody. This is graduate level, advanced level of studies, let's say, but that does not mean that one needs to have an academic formation, background, education in order to follow. autodidacts, everybody who is curious and thinks they can think that they can, you know, follow and participate in the discussion are more than welcome in any in all of the sessions throughout May, June, and the beginning of July. So let me introduce now Greg briefly. Greg Michaelson is a computer scientist who has published widely on the design, implementation, and analysis of programming languages, and most recently on how people solve problems to write programs. With others, principally with Paul, who spoke yesterday, Paul Cockshott, and Allin Cottrell, he has explored the concrete modeling of actually existing economies in value categories and the implications of the format limits of the formal limits of computability theory. Now, he is currently an Emeritus Professor at Heriot Watt University. He is currently also investigating why Marxists turned their backs on formal logic and hence computability until well after the Second World War and the construction of popular ideas about prehistory. Greg is interested in how things aren't, how they might be. He likes to write fiction, just a surprise, play the mouth organ, another surprise, and stand on picket lines, though not usually all at the same time, but possibly, right? So, okay, the floor is yours now, Greg, and tell us when you're ready for a Q&A. Whether you want it in the middle and at the end or just at the end, you know, whatever you prefer is all right with us. We're flexible.
Okay, thank you for your generous introduction, Katerina. I'll just talk through my presentation and then maybe we could discuss at the end. So I'll try and share the screen. Okay, can you all see this?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to talk for 45 minutes about materialism and particularly about mechanical materialism and about dialectical materialism and why I think we should be pursuing mechanical materialism. My talk is very strongly complementary of Paul's talk yesterday, but it takes a slightly different direction and I think builds and develops some of Paul's ideas. So let's begin in the middle. So for Marx and Engels, materialism was about matter in motion, and they were opposed to mechanical materialism, which was based on mid-19th century ideas of machines as mindless automata that followed fixed sequences of actions, so by clockwork. And the difficulty is that mechanical materialism can't account adequately for development and progress. So for Marx and Engels, they elaborated what they called a materialist dialectic. The term dialectical materialism is actually much later. And for Marx and Engels, the materialist dialectic is based on logic plus dialectics. So this is very simplistic for sure. So logic is about how things are, and that's what we now call the propositional calculus that Paul talked about yesterday, and it derives basically from the logic of Aristotle. And dialectics is about how things change after Hegel, though Katerina would argue forcefully that this is maybe more like Socrates and Aristotle than Hegel, but we can come back to this. Now, I'm going to be talking a lot about language. So for me, language is three very important words: an interpreted symbol system. So we have symbols, lexemes, those are the words of the language. We have syntax, grammar, those are the rules for how to form sentences. And we have the semantics, and that's what the sentences mean. And a crucial point is language is for communication. And I'm not concerned with how language is represented or with the medium in which language takes place. I think that's entirely arbitrary. The key question for me is, in language use, what does the interpretation? If language is an interpreted symbol system, where does the interpretation take place? Now, 19th century logic and dialectics couldn't directly account for language. Language has got dynamic properties and interactive properties that these older ideas of semantics really couldn't cope with. Now, as far as I can see, the main source in Marx and Engels for language is Engels' 1876, the part played by labour in the transition from ape to man. Now, I found this surprisingly Lamarckian. Now, Paul pointed out that, of course, Darwin is surprisingly Lamarckian, but Engels is writing almost 20 years after The Origin of Species and 5 years after The Descent of Man. And I think he's writing very much in a kind of Spencerian social Darwinist way rather than a straight Darwinist way. And so for Engels, rather than being able to use your hands and use language, enabling you to reproduce successfully, and therefore your genes are more likely to continue, he is arguing quite explicitly that brain changes are driven by the use of language. And this has got very important implications for how language is treated later in Marxism. So in the Soviet Union, after the Russian Revolution, there was very, very strong ideological opposition to what was termed formalism. And this was after Engels and anti-Turing and the dialectics of nature. And essentially, they saw an awful lot of scientific pursuit as being aimless, sort of knowledge for its own purpose, not knowledge for developing society, and especially not knowledge for developing understanding and transforming class society. And in particular, they associated formal linguistics with logic and with mechanical materialism. So there was a surprisingly intense period of struggle in the 1920s and the 1930s. And it involved a swing from the mechanical materialism to a very strong dialectical position under de Borin. And then de Borin got overthrown. So the mechanical materialists were characterized as being Menshevizing. This was the old fraction of the Russian Social Democratic Party. But then the people who were very into dialectics were seen as too Hegelian, and they were characterized as idealists. And Stalin came up with this great expression, Menshevizing idealism, that you could just use as a catch-all to dismiss your opponents. And one of the ironies was that Trotsky had been a very, very strong critic of logic and formalism, yet he himself was characterized as a Menshevizing idealist. So it's just like an all-purpose way of criticizing people. And this led to the suppression of theoretical approaches that you could characterize as formalists, particularly logic and particularly linguistics. So instead, in the Soviet Union, you got the adoption of an approach to linguistics based on work by Marr. He was a pre-Soviet linguist, but he was sympathetic to the revolution. He had this strange thing called the Geothetic Theory, and his idea was that the Caucasian languages and the Semitic languages preceded the Indo-European languages. And this was seen as very important ideologically for the Soviet Union, who were, increasingly explicitly promoting a Russian-centric view of what they were doing. And Marr also argued that language reflected class society, and that as class society changed, so language changed. Now, as an aside, computers, especially cybernetics, were based on formal logic, on the work Paul talked about yesterday. Alan Turing's work is absolutely central for building computers, but this was anathema in the Soviet Union. So you have no study of computing in the Soviet Union until 1949 and 1950, when suddenly the Soviet military really wants to build nuclear weapons, and you can't do the calculations by hand. You need machines to do the calculations. And of course, there'd been a 20-year gap where no work can be done on this. So in 1950, Stalin completely turned about and he rehabilitated formal linguistics. And he said, rightly, that language goes beyond class. Language is not part of, as he says, the superstructure of society. It's a core feature of human essence. And he also rightly said that semantics was important. Semantics was associated with formalism in logic. But then he said this strange thing, that it wasn't quite as important as the unity of language and thought. And in fact, I've got the name written down here. It's thought that Stalin's stuff was actually written by someone called Chikabava, who was in struggle with the Marxists, who were dominant in linguistics in the Soviet Union at that period. But the good thing was that this rehabilitated formalism, and it led very quickly to the development of the Soviet computer industry that at one point the CIA thought might rival and take over the American computer industry. But that's a whole other story. Something that bothers me is this opposition to formalism really damaged Soviet mathematics and computing. And it's something that Marxists really haven't confronted. If you read work by Soviet computer scientists from the early 1960s, and these are good Communist Party members, and they clearly suffered in the previous 20 years, they have got these guarded asides about how bad things were, but there's no criticism of it. And you can find very, very little about this to the present time. Nonetheless, there was further development of logic within Marxism, particularly Allin Badiou's Concept and Model, which is a really principled and well thought out book. And he develops a materialist conception of formal logic. I read the translation again very recently. It's a very, very good thing to read. It's a really good introduction to formal logic, and it puts it in a very strong materialist context. But still, for Badiou, formal semantics is static and can't account for interaction for the dynamic nature of language. But there were alternatives. So the Soviet cognitive psychologist Vygotsky, in his book Language and Thought, argued that language is socially constructed. And Vygotsky is now seen as a central figure in cognitive psychology down to the present. And Wittgenstein, breaking from his really pure formalism of the Tractatus in 1953, started to explore practical aspects of language in a way that I think we could characterize a materialist in the way that Paul characterized Turing's work as materialist. And he looked at people playing games using language, but quite explicitly. And he talked about how this involved rule following. And then more recently, Marvin Minsky, who's seen as one of the founders of artificial intelligence, not this nonsense of using statistics to mine data, but trying to build real symbolic-based robots. He said that meaning is constructed in embodied interaction. This is what I want to look at now. So my talk is called Mesolithic Capitalism. Of course, this is a joke. The Mesolithic period was after the Paleolithic period. The Paleolithic period corresponded roughly with the Ice Age, and tiny numbers of people in Northern Europe living as hunter-gatherers. And in the Mesolithic period after the Ice Age, people are still hunting and gathering, but they're doing it from a settled perspective. So they have what's called a seasonal round, where typically they have a summer base and a winter base, and they follow the movements of animals and they follow the growth and decay of plants around the year. I've called this Mesolithic capitalism because, as you'll see, my very simple world and language is based around a reproduction scheme, very like that Marx uses in Capital Volume 1 for one economy, which is the shellfish. Now, all the archaeology tells us that Mesolithic people depended utterly on shellfish for their core diet. And that's kind of ironic when you consider how expensive shellfish are now, how much people pay for oysters and mussels in posh city restaurants. This is what Mesolithic people lived on. Now, the trouble with shellfish is that they've got very poor nutritional value. You have to collect enormous quantities of them to stay alive. And all over the world, you can see these huge mounds of shellfish shells, hundreds of tons of them, where people built up layer upon layer upon layer of shells. In the archaeological record, very quickly after the start of the Neolithic, you can see if you do isotope analysis of people's bones, that they almost entirely stopped eating fish and stopped eating shellfish. Clearly, it wasn't a popular way to support yourself. Anyway, I'm now going to show you this satirical single commodity economy based on shellfish. Okay, so we've got the sea and the shore and the land. And growing between the sea and the shore, there are shellfish. And on the land, we've got a capitalist. We know they're a capitalist because they're wearing a top hat. And we've got a worker. We know they're a worker because they're bright red. Okay, so one person eats one shellfish per day. Now the capitalist owns the seashore and rocks are the currency. So the capitalist has got 2 rocks, and for employment, the worker gets paid 1 rock for every shellfish they collect. And then the capitalist sells the shellfish back to the worker, and the capitalist charges the worker 2 rocks for every shellfish. That's 100% profit. Okay, so it's a very, very simple and entirely plausible economy from 7,000 years ago. So let's look at what happens. So this is a language game, so there's a lot of speaking. So the capitalist says, get me shellfish. And the worker says, pay me rocks. And the capitalist says, okay. And the worker says, okay. So this is the myth of the free exchange of labor and capital in the marketplace, which is one of the bedrocks of capitalist ideology. Okay, so in the second stage, the exchange, the worker goes to the shore and gets the shellfish, and the capitalist says, give me shellfish. And the worker says, give me rocks. And the capitalist says, okay. And the worker says, okay. And in the third stage, so the worker's given the capitalist shellfish, the capitalist given the worker's rocks. And now, strangely, the worker is hungry and doesn't have any shellfish. So the worker says, sell me shellfish. And the capitalist says, pay me rocks. And the worker says, okay. And the capitalist says, okay. So the worker gives the capitalist the rocks, and the capitalist gives the workers the shellfish, and the worker eats the shellfish, and the capitalist eats the shellfish. And now new shellfish have grown, and the capitalist has got all the rocks, the worker's got nothing, and the cycle continues. Okay, so this is like Marx's simple capitalist reproduction schema for a one commodity economy. But what I want to do is look at the role of language, not at the economy. So the key thing is for the actors to be able to talk to each other, they've got to share the same model of the world in their brains. So here's the world, and here's the capitalist and the worker in the world, and it's the capitalist, and they've got this model of the world in their brain, and here's the worker, and they've got the model of the world in their brain as well. So you've got how the world is, how the capitalist sees the world, how the worker sees the world, and these have all got to be shared for this to work. Now, it's really important to notice that the actors are aware of themselves. So the actors have got themselves in the model. There's the capitalist in the capitalist model. There's the worker in the worker's model. And they're aware of each other. There's the worker in the capitalist model and the capitalist in the worker's model. So they know that each other includes themselves in the shared model. Okay? And now, for this to work, the world state and the actor models and the dispositions have got to remain mutually consistent. So look, we've got the worker seeing and hearing the world. We've got the capitalist seeing and hearing the world. We've got the worker not just interpreting the world, but changing it. And we've got the capitalist not just interpreting the world, but changing it. And we need the model of the world to stay consistent, even as it changes. So the interpreting and generating mechanisms in the actor's brain must behave consistently. So when I asked if a language is an interpreted symbol system, what does the interpreting? Well, it's got to be something in the brain of the people who are interacting. And that thing has got to include a model that is consistent as the world changes and as they change. But of course, the world isn't dynamic. The world is dynamic. The world isn't static. We go round and round this cycle of simple reproduction, round and round and round. And at each phase, the language interaction between the actors determines the change in the disposition of the world and how the actors are going to behave subsequently. So the model in the actor's brain, it can't just simply be that snapshot of the world, which would correspond to a static semantic model. The actor's model has to be dynamic. They have to be able to understand how the world is changing and predict how the world is changing in order to interact. So during the interaction, the world changes and the model in the actor's brains change and the actor's dispositions change. And it's all driven by the state of the world and the disposition of the actors, and in particular, what utterances, what speech acts are legitimate in those dispositions. We can't get this cycle of reproduction if the capitalists and the workers don't say the right things to each other. If the worker refuses to work, then the capitalist can't acquire any shellfish. If the capitalist refuses to pay the worker, then the worker can't eat. So we've got to have legitimate interaction in order for the world to change in this predictable way. And so the big question is, how can we account for this in a unitary framework? So let's look at the language of our Mesolithic capitalism. The actors have got to share the same language capacity, and that means an ability to generate and interpret meaningful utterances. So look, here's the syntax of the language. We've got things, which are shellfish or rocks. We've got utterances, which is an imperative followed by a thing or saying okay. We've got an imperative, which is get me, give me, sell me, pay me. And so over here, I've drawn for give me rocks, which is the worker demanding payment from the capitalist. We can see it's an utterance, which consists of an imperative, which is give me, and a thing, which is a rock. So there's the syntax, and that gives us the meaningful structure of the utterances. But we also have to have some semantics. And here, the meaning of the utterances has to refer to how the world is and how it might be. So the things that the actors say have to refer to other things in the world, and they have to be part of the interaction that makes the world change. So we've got things, we've got shellfish and rocks, where they can be on the seashore or with the worker, or with the capitalist. And we've got the actors, we've got the worker and the capitalist, we've got actions, they can give and get and take things, they can generate and say and hear and interpret utterances. So how are we going to account for what the actors do? Well, to do that, we have to look at the state of the world, that is a disposition of things and actors. So let's think about the properties that actors have got. They've got inputs, they can hear and they can see things. They've got outputs, they can say things. They've got actions, which are the things they can do to the world, though a lot of the time it's convenient to treat the actions as if they're outputs. And we can tabulate how these change in interaction. So here's the state transition from the worker's point of view. So in the employment state, the worker hears, get me shellfish, they say, pay me rocks, they hear okay, they say okay, then they collect shellfish. And in the exchange state, they hear, give me shellfish, they say, give me rocks, they hear okay, they say okay, whoops, and they give the shellfish and get the rocks. And in the sales stage, they hear, sell me shellfish, they say, pay me rocks, they hear okay, they say okay, they hear okay, they give rocks and get the shellfish, and then in the consumption stage, they consume the shellfish. So that's what happens to the worker. And then for the capitalist, it's the same thing in reverse. This is exactly like double accounting bookkeeping, where you see everything twice from the perspective of the sales and the purchases. It's double entry bookkeeping, but done for linguistic exchange rather than for exchanges of money. So in the employment stage, the capitalist says, get me shellfish, they hear, pay me rocks, they say okay, they hear okay. In the exchange, they say, give me shellfish, they hear, give me rocks, they say okay, they hear okay, then they hear, sell me shellfish, they say, pay me rocks, they hear okay, they say okay. All right? Now, we could also account for the motivations. There are natural motivations like the worker and the capitalist both need to eat, but then there are the social relations. The capitalist doesn't want to work and the worker has to work, and the capitalist needs the worker to work. And important questions to ask politically are, how did these social relations come about? And how can social relations change? Okay, so those are like the fundamental questions. How do we change the world rather than interpreting it? But these are not things we can talk about here. I wanted to look at how language works in mediating the social relations. The important point is that the social relations are in the language use, not in the language game. We could use exactly the same language for workers talking to each other to organise their production without having to give each other rocks to pay each other, for example. The language is independent of the social relations that we're observing. So let's now look at the world. as a totality, and we can tabulate where things are. So in state 1, there are 4 shellfish on the shore. The worker's got no rocks and no shellfish. The capitalist has got 2 rocks and no shellfish, and they talk to each other. And then in state 2, there are 2 shellfish on the shore. The worker's got no rocks and 2 shellfish. The capitalist has got 2 rocks and no shellfish, and they talk to each other. And then in state 3, there are 2 shellfish on the shore. The worker's got 2 rocks and no shellfish. The capitalist has got no rocks and 2 shellfish, and they talk. And then in state 4, there are 2 shellfish on the shore. The worker's got no rocks and 1 shellfish, and the capitalist has got 2 rocks and 1 shellfish. So if you look at this, this looks to me like the trace of a computer program. It looks like we're seeing what's happening in a simulation of our economy, and we've got a variable for the shore, which can contain shellfish. We've got a variable for the workers, but it's actually an object, a class, with a number of rocks and a number of shellfish. And we've got a variable for the capitalist with a number of rocks and a number of shellfish. And we can see speech as inputs and outputs giving rise to these changes in the values of the variables. So of course, I'm coming round to what Paul talked about yesterday. I'm giving a machine a mechanistic account of the semantics of our language game. Now, it's really important that the worker and the capitalist have got consistent knowledge, and to do that, they have to both look at the world and they have to know things about themselves, about each other. So to know who's got what, they can verify that empirically. But to know who needs what, that's learnt, that's inculcated in the social relations that they're both expressing. And the language, again, that's learnt socially, that's socially constructed. So another good political question is, how are these rules maintained? Why would anybody put up with this nonsense? Well, rules, as we know, are maintained through custom and through tradition and through law, and ultimately at the end of the barrel of a gun, through coercion. And of course, the political question is, how can this change? This is what this is all about. How can we change the world as well as understanding it? But today, being an academic, I'm talking about understanding the world. So what sort of machine can interpret and change the world? Is it really only humans? This was a big feature of Marxism, certainly up until Stalin in 1950. And it's understandable. 19th century self-acting machines follow predetermined sequences. If you're ever in Neuchâtel in Switzerland, there's an amazing museum of automata. There are these two on either side are writing automata, and the automata in the middle can play the piano or the organ. They're very, very, very sophisticated. They're beautiful 18th century engineering, but they're completely pre-programmed. If you look around the back, for the writer, you dial up the sequence of letters that you want them to write, and for the musician, you dial up the notes that you want them to play. So in fact, these are modifiable sequences, but still they're preset. Now, there are also apparently much more sophisticated automata, like the mechanical Turk that I showed you earlier, and like Maskelyne's mechanical whist player. But in fact, these have got human beings underneath them. This is a Victorian form of what artificial intelligence researchers call a Wizard of Oz experiment. You know, of course, in the Wizard of Oz, they see the great head of the great Oz, and then Toto pulls down the curtain, and they see behind this rather boring little man moving levers to look impressive. Well, artificial intelligence really can't simulate intelligence. And so typically in experiments, they have a human being behaving in the background as they would like the artificial intelligence system to behave. So it's called a Wizard of Oz protocol. So you can see that Marx and Engels would be skeptical of the potential of self-acting machines. Yes, there are very, very sophisticated machines in factories. There are things that we call self-acting, like the looms, like the spinning machines. But ultimately, they have to be controlled by human beings. And we've got this famous posed question about which is more intelligent, the architect who makes a bad building but is following a plan that they've learnt, or a bee who makes a beautiful beehive out of honeycomb but have got it programmed into their brain. Now, the thing about 19th century automata is that they lack modifiable memory. They couldn't inspect their own state. But this is all changed by mid-20th century computability theory. And indeed, we can classify machines that interpret by the type of memory that they have and the complexity of the language that they can manipulate. And this is after Chomsky. And Chomsky is interesting. He was influenced by the Soviet logician Markov, I think actually the son of the statistician Markov, who's maybe people are more familiar with. Markov came up with a series of rewrite rules that are in many ways very like the instructions Paul showed you for Turing's machines. And indeed, in the Soviet Union, the halting problem was known as Markov's problem. So it was kind of an independent reconstruction of this computability theory from the 30s. What's interesting is that Markov was translated quite early on, and he really influenced American logicians. So Curry, who I think was Alonzo Church's supervisor, who invented combinatory logic, wrote a very good book about mathematical logic that's entirely based on Markov's ideas. And there was a very well-known programming language called Snowball, which was a string rewriting programming language, very widely used. So the university I went to, St Andrews in Scotland, their library system was written in Snowball, but not in a conventional language like COBOL or Fortran. And then Chomsky, his papers on grammar are explicitly influenced by Markov. Chomsky uses Markov's notation in order to explain formal grammar. So it's very nice that these ideas, although they were self-suppressed in the Soviet Union, came back round and proved influential. Anyway, Chomsky articulated this hierarchy of machines, and they're based on the memory capability of the machine and the complexity of the language that the machine could manipulate. So first of all, we've got finite state machines, FSMs, Chomsky's type 3, and they've got no memory. And essentially, the input causes the output and the transition to a new state. And these are the simplest machines we can come across, like traffic lights, which are basically finite state machines that go from red, amber, green, amber, red on a timer. And curiously, in Southern Africa, in the former British colonies, traffic lights are called robots, and road signs tell you robot ahead, which I think is very apposite. So the type 2 languages are called push-down automata. So it's a finite state machine. So it's got inputs and outputs, and then it's got a stack. And stack is potentially, in Aristotle's sense, unbounded. So you've got a stack. You think of it like if you've got a tube full of coins, you can drop a coin in the top until they pile up, and then you can always take out the top coin from the top of the stack, from the top of the pile. So you can push a value onto the top of the stack, you can look at what's on the top of the stack and compare it with your input, and you can pop a value off the stack. That sounds very simple, but actually you can use that for parsing, for checking whether a language in phrase structure grammar corresponds to, whether an utterance in a phrase structure grammar corresponds to the grammar. And the front ends for pretty well all programming languages are based on these push-down automata. So when you're typing something into a computer in, I don't know, HTML or LaTeX or Perl or Python, it's very likely that the software that's processing what you've typed in and telling you whether you've missed out a semicolon is using one of these push-down automata to do the analysis. And so the third class of machine is called a linear bounded automata, a type 1. And it's a finite state machine with a bounded memory. And the finite state machine can arbitrarily inspect and change the memory, but the memory can't change in size. And this corresponds to a real computer with a fixed amount of memory. Of course, you can go on plugging in memory, but nonetheless, at any given time, the computer's got a fixed amount of memory. And it seems pretty clear that human brains are equivalent to this. I'm not saying that human brains are linear bounded automata. Clearly, you can't go into a brain and find a finite state machine in this sense, but brains behave like linear bounded automata. We live, we die, we can only remember so much, we forget things. And then finally, there are Turing machines that Paul talked about very pleasingly yesterday. The Chomsky type 0 languages. And these are finite state machines with potentially unbounded memory. And again, this word potentially is important from Aristotle. At any given point, the memory is bounded, but in principle, you can add more memory open-endedly. So people wrongly talk about Turing machines as having infinite memory. What they have is potentially unbounded memory. And again, Turing machine can inspect and change a memory, and it corresponds to an idealized computer or a brain. And this is the point of reference for mathematical logic and for theories of computing and theories of computers. But much more practically, Turing's writings from 1936 and 1937 were absolutely crucial to the development of the first digital computers, because they embody the idea, as Paul told us, of a program being stored in memory and a computer being able to change its own program. Absolutely fundamental idea. Okay, so we have the Church-Turing hypothesis. So Turing developed his models of machines, and Turing machines really are physical machines. Church developed a symbol called the lambda calculus, which is an algebraic system. And what Church doesn't do, like pretty well all of the other mathematical logicians, is make it explicit that for his calculus to work, you need a human being to actually work the equations. If you make a Turing machine and turn it on, it will go away boodly doing a computation. If you write down a piece of lambda calculus or a piece of recursive function theory, it just sits on the piece of paper. It doesn't do anything until a human being comes along and applies the rules to reduce it. So it's this important difference between Church and Turing, but nonetheless, they showed very, very early on, 1936, 1937, that all of these models of computation are equivalent. Anything that can capture our intuitive ideas of what a computation looks like is equivalent to a Turing machine. So a formalism with a semantics or an interpretation that's as strong as a Turing machine is as strong as you can get. So this includes computers, and it includes programming languages, and it includes brains. And again, I'm not saying a brain is a digital computer. I'm not even saying a brain is analogous to a digital computer. I'm saying it's equivalent to a digital computer. The things a brain can do are in principle no different to the things that a Turing machine or a digital computer can do. And in principle it's important because patently human brains are massively more sophisticated than the computers we can build. But still, in terms of the things they can do, they're equivalent. So we talk about a model or a language being Turing complete. So an arbitrary programming language or an arbitrary computer or an arbitrary human brain is in this sense Turing complete. Paul showed us yesterday a nice picture of Turing's computer, the Pilot Ace. Here's another one I found entirely by coincidence. I think it's one of the earliest pictures of a woman who isn't wearing a military uniform using a computer. All the early pictures of EDSAC, the American machine used to make the atomic bombs, show women in uniform. And this woman is plainly a civilian at the National Physical Laboratory. Anyway, we can use Turing complete languages to express semantics. And we do this either by translating from our new language to a Turing complete language, or by constructing an interpreter in a Turing complete language. Turing complete semantics are standard for programming languages, but they're still problematic for human languages because apart from anything else, we need an explicit model of the world. So people have made limited semantic models of languages. Rudolf Carnap does this, and Alan Badio talks about this, I think with some respect. And more recently, Montague developed semantics for human languages based on the lambda calculus. But the key point again that Paul made about Turing machines can execute models of themselves. Indeed, any Turing complete language can model itself. Any Turing complete language can act as its own meta language. So to account for self-awareness, we don't have to step outside of a system. A system can be self-aware insofar as it can represent itself. And this is clearly a key property of human beings. But then again, actualized models are necessarily going to be partial because actual memory is necessarily bounded. So this is telling us a real limitation to computers, but it's also telling us a real limitation to human beings as well. So to conclude, I don't think dialectics explains the world in the way that Marx and Engels wanted it to. I do think dialectics is a very good way of analysing the world. It's a bit like problem decomposition. But of course, in dialectics, problems decompose into thesis and antithesis. And this is just one way of decomposing problems. There are loads and loads of others. And not all problems decompose usefully to binary opposites. Now, there's been very interesting work done recently in the United States called computational thinking. And it sees problem solving as having 4 stages. You decompose a problem into tiny components. Then you look for patterns amongst the components, similarities. Then you form an abstraction to generalize the patterns that you found. And then you make an algorithm by sequencing the abstractions together to carry out the solution. And I think we can map dialectics, the materialist dialectics, onto this. Okay, well, I think the transformation of quantity into quality is almost certainly nonsense, because every example people come up with has been explained by good old-fashioned science. But I think that the interpenetration of opposites is very like algorithm formation from your components. And I think that thesis, antithesis, synthesis, again, is an interesting way of capturing analysis. And of course, Marxism is absolutely at its best when it's used for explaining the world, particularly explaining the world in terms of social classes and how social classes interact. That's the big strength of the materialist dialectic. And I think I've argued that classical logic alone can't account for interaction. And what I'd like to propose, I think in the spirit of Paul yesterday, is that we explore a materialism based on viewing the world as interacting state machines. Now, of course, that includes human beings as interacting state machines. And I think that takes anything away from human beings. I think human beings are astonishing, and it's a fool who claims that human beings can be explained. Nonetheless, we do interact in a mechanical way. And so I also hope this can be towards a politics of interpreting the world and changing it. And finally, clearly, any computer that has artificial intelligence is going to be aware of its own existence in this Descartesian way. So I've suggested some reading, a very recent book by our friend Ruth Aylett and Patricia Vargas, Living with Robots, from MIT Press. It goes into a lot of detail about the need to embody interaction in Minsky's sense. And then these are more classic books. Of course, I'll do an advertising puff for books I've written with Paul on computationalist Linux and classical econophysics. It's worth rereading the Engels. It's certainly worth reading Minsky for details of this strange period in the Soviet Union when formalism was denounced. Helena Sheehan's book is really good, Marxism and the Philosophy of Science. It goes into a lot of detail on the development of dialectical materialism. So, thank you for listening. I think that's everything that I want to say.
Thanks, Greg. It was fascinating. So we still have some time for conversation, for Q&A, for dialogue. Does anybody want to say something? Do we have raised hands? It takes time until people formulate the question in their minds. In the meantime, I may be, I may break the ice by asking this question. I asked Paul yesterday for some clarification And this is an area that's, you know, not my field of expertise, and I'm really struggling to understand what's going on here. But I have to keep peace with you guys, especially because we're working on this book project together. So I must grapple and try to understand certain concepts. So I asked Paul yesterday about this effective calculus problem. Actually, not problem, solution to the Entscheidung problem, to the decision problem. And also Gödel's reaction to Turing's solution of this problem. I posed this question for the following reason. Gödel praises Turing's solution because it's mechanical. He literally uses, there is a quote from a letter from Gödel where he says that the approach of Turing to this problem, unlike Church's approach, is superior precisely because the solution is mechanical, systemic and mechanical. He does use this word. Also, this mechanical solution that Turing proposes to of the effective calculus, and as a response to the Entscheidung problem, is based on the presupposition that one ought to operate with a finite number of exact instructions. So there is the element of mechanicity. There is an element of mechanicity here. There is an element of finitude here. So do these two things amount to a certain approach you might call materialist, due to the mechanicity, the presence of mechanicity in the approach, first of all. Second of all, due to the presupposition that there should be a finite foundation, so that the calculus is effective, which then, of course, becomes the foundation of the notion of computing that Turing develops. So my point is this not next to, you know, the physical foundations of everything, of computing, of the praxis of mathematics, etc., the things that Paul talked about yesterday? Is this not, in addition to those elements, something that speaks of a certain materialist approach we find in Turing? And therefore, are formalism and mechanicity mutually exclusive? And therefore, do you really think that, is this actually the real reason for this epistemological differences between Stalin and Marx? So, yeah, first, explain to me whether I understand well this entire conglomerate of notions around Gödel and the effective calculus and the relevance of finitude and mechanicity there. And second of all, if mechanicity and formalism are not mutually exclusive, as they are not, for example, in Saussurian linguistics, that they're not, they're one and the same thing there. So if they are not mutually exclusive, was these, or could there be another reason for the differences between Marx and Stalin? According to you, I mean, I don't know about this dispute, so I would like to learn more. Two questions in one, yeah.
Okay, so let's wind back a wee bit.
Okay.
So very, very quickly, around the time that Engels is writing, there are really three important revolutionary changes in logic.
Mm-hmm.
You have the predicate calculus that adds universal and existential quantification to propositional calculus.
Mm-hmm.
And loads of people are doing this, but the person we identify is Augustus de Morgan. He's the name that often comes up. Mm-hmm. Secondly, and Engels was certainly aware of this, there was the work on set theory, particularly by Cantor, and Cantor's ideas about infinity. And if you look at Dialectics of Nature, Engels is really, really unhappy with Cantor and with the infinities. Mm-hmm. So I think, and this is ill-informed, I'm sure someone can correct me, this comes out of Marx wrestling with the idea of infinity in the calculus, and mm-hmm. Marx trying to get to grips with Hegel in turn, writing about the calculus. So this is something Paul knows a lot more about. There is this mm-hmm. layering of what can we do about infinity. So Cantor's coming up with these apparently bizarre notions of infinity, and Engels is deeply unhappy with that. Okay, mm-hmm. So that's one thread. Okay, then there are two other components. You have got also in Italy, Peano comes up with this way of characterizing arithmetic based on starting with 0 and being able to add 1 an arbitrary number of times, and then having essentially an inductive schema where mm-hmm. you explain, if you can do something n times, this is how you do it n+1 times. Mm-hmm. So you've got these three things. You've got propositional calculus plus predicate calculus, and then you've got set theory, and you've got Peano arithmetic. So okay. Russell and Whitehead are taking up this challenge, I think originally comes from Frege, of can mathematics describe itself? So they're using predicate calculus plus set theory, okay? And they build Principia Mathematica, and Russell comes up with the paradoxes that Paul alluded to. So that's one important stream. Another important stream is Peano arithmetic plus predicate calculus, and this is developed by Stephen Kleene, who worked with Church in the United States, into what we call recursive function theory. Okay, and so Hilbert is really, really impressed by what Russell and Whitehead are doing. So he poses these three questions. If mathematics can explain itself, can it show itself to be consistent? So you can't have any contradiction in mathematics. If it can explain itself, can it show itself to be complete? So there aren't any things that are obviously theorems that can't be proved as theorems. And then the Entscheidungs problem, is there a mechanical way of telling whether or not an expression is a theorem? Okay, so Gödel's stuff shows that you can't have a consistent and a complete system. And Turing stuff and then Church's stuff shows that the Entscheidungs problem is unsolvable for arbitrary expressions. Now, I'm sorry, this is a long-winded answer.
No, I need this in order to understand. Okay.
You'd asked about finiteness. So finiteness is really, really important because for practical purposes, if something's a theorem, you need to know whether it's a theorem or not in a finite number of steps. Yeah. You want to do things with it. You want to use it to build other things, to do other mathematics, and ultimately to solve real-world problems. So this thing of it being determinable in a finite number of steps is really, really, really important. Okay, but it also has ideological importance. So after Gödel's results came out, you get people writing idealist nonsense about how Gödel's results show the superiority of human thinking to mechanical thinking. I think there is a resonance of this in the 1930s debates. I can't establish that. I need to read some more. But you can see clearly in the Soviet critique of cybernetics, they're saying computers are dehumanizing workers. Computers are there to replace workers. You can see this in the writings about cybernetics. Sorry, I'm being attacked by kittens. I have two.
Mine are sleeping, so
I'm a hassler. So okay. So there's this idea that, okay, well, the capitalists are just going to replace all the workers with machines and the workers are going to starve. And it's as if these Soviet people hadn't actually bothered reading Marx, didn't understand that the source of capitalist profit was human labor, you know? And clearly capitalists are only going to replace humans with machines when employing humans is too expensive. Okay, so this question of infinity plays to, are humans superior to machines, and what are the limits of human capacity? So I think that's an important ideological question. Now, this thing about effective calculation versus mechanical calculation, well, it turns out that they're the same thing. An algorithm is a mechanical procedure that terminates. And I think algorithm is what Turing called it, and effective calculation is what Church called it. And it is a sequence of reductions in the lambda calculus that terminates. So it's actually the same question. Does a Turing machine terminate over a given tape? It's the same question as, does a lambda expression evaluate in a finite amount of time? If the camera goes off, this is because the kitten, which is very much not a ghost in the machine, has unplugged my USB lead. Okay, so, and it's also important to us, so this is something Paul and I have written a lot about. There is a very strong idealistic current in current physics and computer science about the idea of being able to do transfinite computation, which would transcend what current digital computers can do. And particularly there are people at, I think it's Cambridge, Hogarth and Nemeti, and they've got these bonkered ideas that you can, I'm paraphrasing, Paul again can explain this better, you can throw a computer trying to solve the Entscheidungsproblem into a black hole, and you can therefore do an infinite computation in a finite amount of time. Okay, and the maths is very, very complicated. Again, Paul will talk about this, but it's plainly not going to be a practicable technology in the short term. Yeah. There have been lots of other proposals for transfinite computation, and all of them depend on being able to marshal an Aristotelian actualized infinity. That's at the heart of it. Now, the alternative approach is the constructivist approach, which is something that Markov proposed that builds on Breuer and the work of the intuitionists. And indeed, in Britain, communist logicians in the 1930s thought intuitionism was the way for formal logic to go. They didn't seem to appreciate its idealist formation. Markov reconstructs intuitionist logic as a constructivist logic, and that plays very, very nicely to other constructivist currents in Soviet ideology in that period. And indeed now we can see this in programming languages, in particular new ideas called dependent types, where you can express much stronger properties of programming languages than you used to be able to previously. So all of these things have real practical currents. So the question of finiteness and infinity is really very, very central to what's going on. But the difference between a machine and a calculus plus a human being is not so important if we accept the materiality of a human mathematician working with equations. So sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
No. I really needed this explanation, and it makes things much more clear. There are other questions, obviously. Let me see who's first. Just a second. I can see Yulia Nikolaeva raising hand. Who else? Yulia, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. To join the attacking kittens. Actually, I was going to mention Cantor. I'm a doctoral student in information systems, and I research human-computer interaction with background in social science, sociology. And thank you. It was very interesting. And also, I think I will at least read very well into your book on limits of computation. It was very interesting to find it. I have a few points to say. The attacking part is actually, I think I just heard the most brilliant ever demonstration of total helplessness of materialist ideology for any, I guess, predictive or explanatory. Marxism is best in, I made notes, best in explaining the world, I'm sorry to whom, and also without law enforcement. Does it really work? Language is not, you said language is not connected how social relation works. I'm surprised. Probably there are different theories of language. Also, worker, you said worker can be considered an object class. Objectification of human beings is a political action. No, I should say. Also, just you know, small notes in general.
Just one suggestion. I'm sorry, because you have several different comments.
My message, yes, just my general message. Just my general message.
Okay.
Thank you for this demonstration. I would like to share two authors. First of all, there was American anthropologist Marvin Harris, and I think his work will be very advancing for the theory blog that I just heard, and it will make things a little more, I guess, working for modeling real processes. And also I was actually searching for this name. There was a Polish mathematician. There was Alfred Tarski. And actually, Alfred Tarski, he lost the competition for the position in one Polish university to this Leon Świstek. And Leon Świstek, he died in Soviet camps. And I guess Leon Świstek's theory of social relations and language would be really advancing, I guess.
So first of all, my point about objects was a computing term. I agree absolutely, objectification of people is appalling. It is a political act. But I was using a computing sense of object-oriented modeling. And this is not about how we treat people. It is about how we represent information. Okay, so it's a computing term. It's not meant as a political analogy. Now, the point about social relations, obviously, social relations are mediated in language. And obviously, we talk in ways determined by our social relations, but language transcends social relations. Now, my partner, who I hope is going to look after the kittens, did her PhD on a theory, an American theory, that there are differences between the linguistic behavior of people depending on their social class. A guy called Bernstein wrote about this, and Nancy did big experiments in schools all around here, and she found no difference whatsoever in the language. And in fact, the idea of different codes is a way of preventing working class children from getting a good education, because their allegedly poor language use marks them out as not being competent for developed education. So these ideas of class difference in language are actually quite dangerous, because they can be used to discriminate and to control people. It's much better to see language as a plastic thing that is social. Social relations are expressed in language, but social relations don't construct language. How we use language is a political question, but how we construct language is a social question that goes beyond the class question. And thirdly, thank you very much for your reference to Tarski. Tarski is really interesting because he worked on semantics and he reconstructed the Entscheidungsproblem for the idea of truth. He came up with a logical statement about truth that is obviously true and yet contradictory at the same time. And it's very nice that you mentioned him, thank you, because I was taught about Tarski many, many years ago, and because of our focus on computing, I generally forget about him, and I should really go back and read him again. So thank you for mentioning him.
And I also put to chat the name of this Polish man who first succeeded from him for the position. I think it's very interesting, interesting author.
Thank you. I'll certainly look out for that.
Okay. Raj.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the lecture. I have two questions. The first one is that you mentioned that during Soviet, especially during the Stalinist era, how dialectical logic led to the collapse of computing. And I just wanted to ask whether it had to do with their desire to always link the particular to the universal. So did it have anything to do with that? And if that is the case, then that's a philosophical question. And what sort of logic actually enables us to do it now with machine learning and things like that? Is it still possible, or it ends up becoming a futile exercise to think of even computing and linking the particularity to the universality?
Sorry, I'm a slave to the kittens. I'm sure you understand this.
That's completely okay, no problem. So that's the first question.
Sure.
And then the second question, I think, sort of links to it, is that in like from Aristotle to Hegel, so that is where formal logic and critique of formal logic through dialectical logic happens. And I wanted to know if with deep learning and things like that, and especially with the enhanced coding powers, if we are actually able to somehow incorporate dialectics into it, or does it even go beyond it, or if it is something else. Like if you could talk a bit more about it, because I'm still not very clear about these things.
Okay, so your first question, I think the suppression of formalist logic was about the politics. I don't really think it was about philosophy at all. It was about people jostling for power, and partly it was about displacing people from the Tsarist regime and replacing them with people who were seen as politically reliable. And it's all about this idea of proletarian science being distinct from science in general. So I don't think the debate over formalism was philosophical in that sense, but I really recommend you read Helena Sheehan's book. She talks about this in a lot of detail, okay? Secondly, I'm very, very skeptical about machine learning. So, and this is for a number of reasons. First of all, machine learning is about doing very sophisticated statistics. And it's based entirely on generalizing from a particular data set. So, and it is lossy in the sense that in order to make these abstractions, you have to throw information away. So your machine learning is necessarily generalizing and therefore failing to capture some of the essence of what it's abstracting over. There's a further problem, which is a political problem, which is who decides how to train the machine learning system. So it's well known in social science that everything we know about human psychology, we actually know about white men in their early 20s studying in American universities, because that's where almost all psychological data comes from. And we get exactly the same thing with machine learning. It is trained on very, very heavily biased data sets. And so it is trained, for example, almost exclusively on white people and almost exclusively on men for pattern recognition. And this means that machine learning systems used, for example, for security are much more likely to select people who aren't white as being potential targets for being questioned. So there are these very, very strong biases built into the choice of the data, and the data is losing information. But there's a third, more fundamental problem, which is that you can take a machine learning system and you can print out all of the internal states of the system, but you can't reverse engineer them to make a logical description of what the thing has learnt. All you can see is how these different things contribute to weights that result in the final decision. So you can't reverse engineer machine learning to learn anything useful about the world. All you can get is strong assurances that if this happens, then it's well correlated with that. There's a further problem. Sorry, you've really got me on a what we call a hobby horse. Yeah. A further problem is with Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem is really central to machine learning. It's based on the idea of prior probability. Whenever you ask a statistician where do prior probabilities come from, they change the subject because it's a very, very difficult question. Prior probabilities, again, bias what you're doing with your machine learning. So just finally, you mentioned Hegel's dialectical logic. So Paul, a couple of days ago, actually passed me a paper by a Chinese engineer who has built a complete formal system based on Hegel's logic. And I had a quick look at it, and it looks like just any of these other formal systems. It's very striking. All through the Soviet period, people tried to build dialectical logic systems. And I think some of them did, but they weren't any use for anything. Yeah, you couldn't actually use them to make real models of the world. And I think that's a big difference between logic and computer science. Computer science is about making animated models of reality. And it's very, very materialist and indeed Marxist practice. You know, you look at the world, you make a model of the world, you express the model in the program, you run the program, and then you look at whether the behavior of the program corresponds to the world and corresponds to what's in your head. So even though I don't like the word, it's an astonishingly dialectical process, programming. And it's quite unlike doing logic, which is really all about building a system and proving its properties. So doing logic is mathematics, and Badiou says all science is experimental, and mathematics and logic are clearly experimental as well. But in a pragmatic sort of sense, logic is only any good when you use it to solve problems. As Paul said yesterday, these limits of computation are philosophically interesting, but they're completely at the edge of what we can practically do in terms of solving problems. And it turns out in a practical sense, nobody has actually built any interesting models of anything using dialectical logic. Maybe that would be a cool thing to try, you know?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And I agree with you, like almost completely. The thing is, I'm doing my PhD and I have to use a lot of artificial neural networking and stuff like that. So I just wanted, and the kind of, since I come from engineering background, there's not a lot of philosophical discussion happening around it. So I just wanted to get more clarification about it. And also something that Paul said yesterday, like I would be interested to know if Paul agrees, because I asked the question to Paul yesterday and his answer, from whatever I remember, contradicts with yours a bit, but maybe like we don't have time to go into it now. But
Great. Sure.
Thank you.
What did you ask Paul and what did he say?
What was it exactly? It was regarding, I think he was a bit more generous towards the possibilities of machine learning or deep learning.
Yes. So Paul has done some really interesting applications of machine learning, and I think that's useful. But I think it's important to be skeptical about what you can achieve with it.
Yeah, and I was a bit skeptical, so I just wanted another explanation. Yeah, now I have a more holistic understanding. Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Thanks a lot. Now we have Alexander Wilson, who would like to ask something if he's still around. Sorry, Alexander, missed your message.
That's okay.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for that great talk. Once again, super informative. I learned a lot on this one. I wanted to ask, since you obviously must know a lot about this, because I was thinking about what you were saying about the church Turing thesis. And one thing I've been interested in recently that you must know about is the Curry-Howard isomorphism and the kind of logical connection between programming and logic, or between a proof and a type.
Sure.
Where a type, a typing system is basically a proof system, and generating a proof of something is generating, producing an element of a type, or this kind of relationship between types and their elements, and how that, because it seems to me that that's a great candidate for something that would be, something that's very close to dialectical materialism, where the proof of something, you need to actually produce something. There's a construction that is needs to come out of it, that needs to be shown. You can't just and this is like, it has a long history. It reminds me of what Paul was saying as well, about how Turing saw the world, where he would look at he gave the example of looking at a sheet of paper and not being able to take in all of the digits on the sheet of paper, and needing a kind of algorithm to, needing some deductive analytical method to kind of grasp the patterns within, a large, say a large database or something. And this goes back a long way, right? The whole, already Descartes was talking about this in his rules for the direction of mind. He keeps saying intuition is best. Ideally we could absorb it all into our minds, but we're finite individuals, and we need to, the next best thing is this deductive process, this analytic process where we can follow one procedure after another and get to get closer to the truth. And it seems to me like that now is materialized in the Curry-Howard isomorphism, or its extensions, and different things like homotopy type theory and things like that, where this idea of the uninterrupted sequence of procedures. Descartes was saying we can't have any jumps. We need to follow the deductive procedure right to the end, and show the demonstration. Leibniz was also talking about this exteriorization, characteristica universalis. So do you think that Curry-Howard isomorphism? Well, basically that's the question. What do you think of Curry-Howard isomorphism in relationship to this, dialectical materialism? Is that a candidate for kind of a computational example of what that might mean?
Well, it certainly is. It's certainly directly analogous to doing a proof. So there's a very interesting paper by a computer scientist called Phil Wadler called Programs as Proofs. And he's arguing essentially that a program is a proof of its type. But the question really is it useful to think about it that way around? I mean, that's mathematically interesting. But what you really want is what the program does, not what its properties. And actually, thank you for asking that, because you made me realize that type is actually analogous to this prior static sense of semantics. A type is a timeless property of a program, but a program is a dynamic thing. And what's interesting is that when you pose the Curry-Howard isomorphism, lots of different programs have got the same type. So it's like saying that for a given thing you want to prove, there are lots of different ways of proving it. And that's kind of interesting in itself, for sure. So yeah, it's more than an analogy. It is very much an equivalence.
Right.
I'm not sure how to think through what the pragmatic implications are, but thank you very much for asking. It's an intriguing thing to think about.
Well, thanks for the talk. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Sorry, there is an entire discussion here in the chat. Perhaps it's addressed to you, Greg, at 7:52. The question is from Abhinash Rai. Regarding language's plasticity and its role in mediating social relationship, does this theory, so to speak, also hold for other social relations like gender, ethnicity, etc., apart from class relations? Could you give some examples of how it would apply in those other social relations? Then somebody tried to offer a response to this, but I think that this is clearly a question addressed to you. So regarding language's plasticity and its role in mediating social relationships, does this theory, so to speak, also hold for other social relations like gender, ethnicity, apart from class?
Oh, clearly it does, and clearly there are enormous and important debates around how we use language, most recently around how we use language about gender and about identity. And this is kind of a complex thing, and I'm happy to have the debate, but I'm not sure that this is the place to do it. But I'll make an interesting observation, is that language is very plastic, but language is also quite heavily structured. So in debates about gender, people have tried to introduce talking about a cisgender as opposed to a transgender. It's really striking how little that language has taken off outside of a very restricted gender discourse. You don't pick up the newspaper and read people talking about cis women or trans women in this sort of way at all. Attempts to modify language in order to align it with a particular perspective are actually very, very difficult. On the other hand, where it's been most successful is in the removal, particularly in English, of always using the male gender to talk about people in general, which clearly leads to a bias against women. And I think that's been very, very important for uncoupling notions of particular social roles and particular social behaviours are gender determined. But it's involved a huge, huge, huge movement for that to come about. And it's a change that's happened certainly very recently, and it's taken a long, long time to happen. So language is certainly another place for struggle, but it involves people with clearly articulated positions and organisation and ultimately force to bring about these changes. We can see the same thing in debate about race. Language now that's seen as totally abhorrent in describing people who aren't white was commonplace when I was a child, and people weren't embarrassed to use it. Now it's entirely unacceptable in almost all public discourse, and people lose their jobs over it. People lose their jobs over using sexist language, and this is tremendous. You know, this is a progressive advance. Sure, it's an advance within bourgeois society, but still it's a necessary advance. So, yeah, so it's very long-winded, but yes, this language is plastic. We can struggle around it. The struggle depends, as in all struggles, on the balance of forces behind each position.
All right. It's also important to add that there are different ways of talking about language. I mean, you can talk about language from a sociological perspective, from the perspective of cultural theory, etc., and also from linguistic perspective. From linguistic perspective, it's simply a limited type of conversation. It's inapplicable to these questions, I guess, raised here, but we will certainly address questions of this sort in some of the forthcoming seminars. Any other comments?
So could I just come back to Julia's point about decolonization research is in the chat, and can the subaltern speak? So clearly the subaltern can speak. The question is, are they allowed to speak? So that their ability to speak is about human beings using language. Whether they're allowed to speak is a power question and a class question. So it's not a question about what language is being used. It's a question about being allowed to use the language. And I think these are important differences.
Okay, Julia, do you want to unmute yourself?
Just to comment, I mentioned this text because actually anthropology is not my major. I was just always interested in anthropology, and the text, it's a scary story, the analysis of widow sacrifice in India, this burning of widows, and anthropological analysis, how it happens and why it happens. The analysis in this text is just so brilliant, but I'm not sure in which paradigm she works. Definitely not materialist paradigm, but I'm not sure in which paradigm. I'm sorry.
Post-structuralism. It's certainly not materialist, although it would be a reductionism to, say that all post-structuralism is necessarily opposed to, or I don't know, not founded on any form of materialism. I would say that one might identify my materialism or materialist stance in Donna Haraway. So it's not valid necessarily for the entire realm of post-structuralism, but for most of it, yes. And I'm almost certain that Spivak is not a materialist. At least this is my reading. I don't know about Greg's.
Yes, Spivak isn't a materialist at all.
Yeah.
So, right. I'm not familiar with the writing, but I think I'm very cautious about labeling something as being this or that or the other. I think I want to look at things in a context. So I think this thing that Paul and I are arguing about Turing being materialist is actually very new. Yeah, I'm not trying to claim we've got some sort of cosmic insight, but I'm not seeing people arguing this before. But if you put this to a conventional logician or a conventional philosopher, they'd say, oh no, that's complete nonsense. Turing is obviously part of the Russell tradition of realist philosophy, and then go and read Turing. Turing says nothing about philosophy. All Turing's interested in is building his machines, building his logical systems. So, whether or not someone is a materialist, I'm not. I think we should maybe focus on what they're arguing and what we can take out of their argument. I mean, if someone is basing their argument on the existence of God, that seems to me to be a good reason to reject it. But if someone isn't espousing explicitly a materialist position, that isn't a good reason to reject it. So I think we should be open. I'm not sure how useful slicing and dicing ideas is other than in struggle. That's my own feeling. I've seen so much of the last 50 years wasted by people shouting at each other about you're a Stalinist, you're a Trotskyist, when actually what we've seen is the overthrow of actually existing socialism, the establishment of a deeply ruthless capitalist system, while the ideologues were arguing with each other rather than uniting and opposing. So yeah, maybe, as William Morris observed in the 1890s, when people are talking about philosophy rather than about how to apply the philosophy to changing the world as well as interpreting it, maybe that's a sign that our politics is going into some sort of retreat. So maybe we should be more positive. What can we take out of this? How can we use it to change the world as well as interpreting it? Sorry, I know that sounds very naive, but I think we underestimate the utopian in materialism and in communism, and maybe we ought to give that a bit more credence.
Yeah, good point. Okay, maybe we should wrap up on this note, unless there are some pressing questions in the audience.
Maybe.
Davor?
Can I ask a question? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, you can hear me.
If Greg agrees, are you tired perhaps, Greg?
Okay,
there is another question. This will be the last.
Okay, just a short one.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Michaelson, for the talk. I would like to ask one more question, if you could clarify or go a little bit deeper on something that you said earlier. You said that dialectics, you don't believe that this is the only way to formalize change, right? You said this earlier. I mean, okay, everybody knows that it's kind of, it would be a very strange world, right? If everything that is happening would be working dialectically. So I was wondering, could you name a few other ways how things are changing? I mean, we know from, evolution theory and so on is working differently than Hegelian dialectics, but what other formal types or formalizations or models of change do exist? Maybe you know some of them. And if you could add those that have been mathematically formalized even. Yeah. So for example, from school, I remember things like growth things, like logarithmic growth or something like this can be formalized. Or we have the catastrophe theory, I think would also be probably a formalization of change in dynamical systems. But I was wondering if you could, list up.
Sure. So, right. As you'll have gathered, my grasp of dialectics is kind of naive. This is why it's good to be working with people like Katerina, who I think can give a much more precise formulation of it. I'm most familiar with approaches to analysis that are based in computing. So I think the kind of dialectics parody in synthesis, antithesis, thesis, and I've put it in reverse quite consciously to make us think about the thing that we have and how we've decomposed it. That would be called divide and conquer. And that is a very, very, very widely used technique in computing for writing parallel programs. So you've got a big problem, you break it up into two smaller problems, you do the smaller problems on separate computers, and you bring the result back together. But you can take those two smaller problems, you can break them up into two smaller problems again, do the whole thing on 4 computers. So you can do this not ad infinitum, but very, very widely. Now, I've memory of looking at Hegel and there being like this tree diagram, that starts at the top with stuff like being and nothing, and at the bottom somehow proves that the actually existing Prussian state is the inevitable outcome of history. Sorry, I'm making a bad joke at Hegel's expense, of course. But so that struck me, that's kind of classic divide and conquer approaches. But there are lots of other ways of breaking things up. So you can do a distributed analysis where you pull out components that are relatively independent of each other and analyze them separately. So if you were analyzing an economy, for example, you could pull out one slice for energy, yeah? You could pull out one slice for food production. You could pull out one slice for transport. So in what sense is that a dialectical division? I could reconstruct that as a dialectical argument. But my point is that I think dialectics is a way of breaking a problem space up, and it's just one way of doing it. Now, you mentioned things like catastrophe theory, and again, that's a really fascinating area of mathematics to do with how things change suddenly. But it isn't about the transformation of quantity into quality. It's about, in an equation, you hit a certain value, then inevitably things change. So if you look at the heat equations for boiling water, like, you turn the kettle on and suddenly the water turns into steam. Is that the transformation of, quantity into quality? Well, actually what's happening is in the equations describing the bonds between the water molecules in the liquid state, the heat is such as to, at a certain point necessarily, the bonds begin to break and you get the steam appearing. Yeah. So Engels somewhere talks about aniline dye making things blue, and that being an example of, quantity into quality. But now we know if you analyze aniline dye, we can look at what its refractive properties are and what its spectroscopic properties are, and why in a particular sort of light using aniline gives you blueness. Yeah. So dialectics is, I think, a problem-solving approach, and it's potentially a useful problem-solving approach, but it's not the only one, and all these other ones sit next to it. And computer science is a very messy discipline. It's really, really opportunistic. It grabs what works, So it's very hard to typecast in a more traditional philosophical sense. But thank you. It's an interesting question. I really hope so. You maybe know that Katerina and Paul and I are writing a book about materialism, and I really hope these are the sorts of questions that we can tackle.
Certainly. Of course. Should we wrap up now?
Please, I'm hungry. And
yeah. We'll do that. It's the end of the session of the seminar. Okay, so the next cluster of 3 Laruelle or non-philosophy related more directly and less indirectly talks is happening next week on the 24th, the 26th, I think, and the 27th. So Anne-Françoise Schmidt, John Molarkey, or Molarka, I don't know how to pronounce it, and Ray Bressier next week, same time. Zoom links and YouTube links will be available on our webpage. And Adam is going to be the host, as we agree, right? Okay, so we shall end here and release you from your duty. Greg, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And keep in touch. Yeah, okay. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.